one of the things I came to believe is that a lot of people have trouble accessing mathematical and scientific ideas, and usually a big part of that is because those ideas are usually presented in symbolic forms. So people study maths and science by reading textbooks, looking at equations. But when you look at what we're actually studying, we're studying the physical world with physics. And so I came to believe that it must be possible to convey these kinds of ideas through physical and material means. After all, that's what nature's doing. You know, a star is a star, whatever equations might underlie it. And so I and my sister Christine Wertheim founded the Institute for Figuring with the idea that we wanted to engage people with scientific and mathematical ideas, but through material modes of play. So basically what our claim is that a lot of ideas that are usually represented symbolically can be instantiated in material form, and thus through those material forms you can engage with them through playful activities. Usually when we study mathematics and physics is a science which basically attempts to articulate the world in terms of mathematics, we learn these subjects symbolically through reading textbooks and studying equations. And it's really like learning a very difficult foreign language. Mathematics is a language. It's not what's called a natural language because it's not spoken, it's only purely written. And unless you learn that language very young, it's almost impossible to get into it later. But mathematics is used to describe many things in the physical world, from atoms to stars to, patterns of energy, electrons going down wires in our homes, holograms, and all these things are physical things. So our claim at the Institute for Figuring is that in some sense the physical comes first and the language, the mathematical language is used to describe them, as it were, comes second. So there is a sense in which the language is derivative of the thing, and we believe that you can go directly to the thing and study the thing in and of itself and learn a great deal about it. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to pass a university exam, but that shouldn't be the only goal. There are a lot of ways of learning, and we think of embodiment as being that embodied activities can be powerful forms of learning as well as symbolic forms of learning. A couple of years ago, the Exploratorium held a conference called Art as a Way of Knowing, and I was one of the speakers. It was a wonderful conference. And I think the premise of the conference was that art was something that could not only produce aesthetically interesting experiences, but that artistic practices could also be a way of knowing and exploring what reality is, which is, I guess, what we tend to think of science as doing. And I agree with this premise. I think that art can be a way of knowing and literally of experimenting about reality. And I think the Crochet Coral Reef project is a very good example of this. This project begins with extremely simple algorithm: crochet end stitches, increase 1. But when you take that basic algorithm and start experimenting with what kind of deviations are there in that code, what kind of complexifications can I add to that code, what does changing the code do to the morphology of the finished form? And that is like what happens in nature as you get genetic mutation and genetic diversification. You get a changing morphology of creatures. You begin with pond scum and you gradually evolve peacocks and elephants and redwoods. And with the Crochet Reef project, a similar thing happened. Everybody starts doing, usually for their first one, just a very simple, straightforward hyperbolic plane. But then people move in different directions and they say, what if I did a sprout out here and kind of put a little puff bit here? Or some people get into really branched structures. Some people make tubular structures with bobbles on them. And each of these things, which are the result of changing the code, produce morphological variation. And I don't think there is no way to know exactly what you would get until you do the experiment and see. And so that process, the process of the reef evolving a taxonomy of form, has really been an experimental process. That there were many times in the development of the project where we thought, oh, we've seen everything now, there's nothing more that's possible. And then some contributor would have gone off in some entirely new direction and send us something in the post that we would never have imagined. And what they were doing was literally experimenting, discovering new additions to the structures. This is very much the same way that chemistry works. You know, chemists start with simple molecules and then they gradually learn ways to link them together, to branch them, to chain them, to get much more complicated molecules. So a lot of science works by this sort of process, starting with simple forms, simple structures, and then experimentally working out how to complexify the structures. So in this sense, I think art can genuinely be a way of experimentation. And that is always experimentation in the physical world is a way of knowing about form. It's, you can say, what's the purpose of it? If a chemist is developing ever more complex structures, that tends to lead, for instance, to new drugs which have pharmacological effects, better sleeping pills, better anti-anxieties, better antidepressants. So you can ask the question, what is the outcome of the artistic experimentation? It doesn't have instrumental effect in the way that, say, chemistry does. But I would argue that it has psychological effect. It can produce experiences, it will produce experiences that haven't been had before. And the effect of that experience could be quite powerful. We hope that, for instance, in the case of our Coral Reef project, that one of the effects will be that people will see the incredible beauty of these artistically created reefs and go, oh my gosh, the real things, the living reefs are in danger. We must really think about this. We must think about our practice. Can we do something to save the living ones, hopefully being in part inspired by the artistic ones?